to the Middlebury Institute. Tonight we have a panel discussion on the Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. We would like to thank the Middlebury Institute of International Studies and the James Marshall Center for Non-Proliferation Studies for the use of the Irvine Auditorium for this panel discussion, with special thanks to Masako Toki, Education Project Manager of the Center for Non-Proliferation Studies. We'd also like to thank the co-sponsors for tonight's program, the Monterey Peace and Justice Center, the Middlebury Institute of International Studies at Monterey, UNA USA Monterey Bay Chapter, and the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom Monterey County Branch. I'd like to note that the Costa Rican United Nations Ambassador Elaine White Gomez, who served as the president of the UN conference that negotiated the nuclear weapons ban treaty this year, graduated from the Middlebury, then the Monterey Institute of International Studies in 1993 with an MA in International Policy Studies. So you guys have a pretty powerful going university here. You could be very proud. Tonight's panel discussion is truly timely. In light of what is happening regarding our nation's foreign policy and actions concerning North Korea and Iran, and the plans being made by this administration to upgrade and modernize our nuclear weapons program. And it's especially timely in light of the announcement by the Norwegian Nobel Committee on October 6th that the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, ICAN, was the recipient of the 2017 Nobel Peace Prize. In other words, given to an organization rather than a person. The award, yes, amazing, right? Wonderful. The award is in honor of ICAN's efforts to advance the negotiations that led to the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, adopted on July 7, 2017 at the United Nations. ICAN is a Geneva-based coalition of disarmament activists from 100 nations around the world. A press release from the Norwegian Nobel Committee states, "The organization is receiving the award for its work to draw attention to the catastrophic humanitarian consequences of any use of nuclear weapons and for its groundbreaking efforts to achieve a treaty-based prohibition of such weapons." Tonight's program will last roughly an hour and will be followed by a question and answer period. At 8:45, there will be a reception in the atrium, an opportunity to further discuss the subjects raised by panelists and engage in informal social networking. The moderator for tonight's program, who will introduce the four speakers, is Larry Levine. Larry has been a community organizer and leader of community groups for all of his adult life. He was an early Peace Corps volunteer in Brazil and led a civil rights and anti-poverty program in the rural south of the U.S. Here on the Monterey Peninsula, he has been the president or board member of a variety of community service and world affairs organizations, a couple of which I had the honor to serve with him. He is most known for serving 14 years as the volunteer president of our local United Nations Association chapter, during which time, but get this now, during which time it launched UNA's International Documentary Film Festival, sponsored demining in Bosnia and Afghanistan, and became the largest UNA chapter in the country with over 800 members. Yeah, that's our little UNA chapter here led by this man. During this time, he also served on the UNA USA National Board and as National Chair for 4 years. Larry received degrees from the Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs at Princeton and the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard. It's my pleasure to introduce my friend, Larry Levine.
And thanks to you, my friend, Phil Butler. And good evening and welcome, everyone. I must say that I consider myself quite a news junkie and pretty well informed about international events. However, when I was first invited to serve as moderator this evening, I was not even aware of this brand new convention. I quickly did some research of my own. Some of you may be in the same situation, and I expect there will be a lot of new learning here this evening. This evening, as you can see, we will have 4 panelists, diverse people with diverse backgrounds and from somewhat diverse generations, who will each have roughly 15 minutes for their comments. And as Phil said, following the speakers, there'll be a question and answer period using the 2 microphones that are in the aisles. And following that, at about 8:45, there will be a reception upstairs in the lobby and an opportunity for you to talk informally with the speakers and with each other and to share in some refreshments. As I said, our 4 speakers come from very different backgrounds, although they all share the same concern about the great dangers of nuclear weapons. And what I'm going to do now is introduce all 4 of them at the beginning, and then we can move smoothly from one speaker to the other. So these are the introductions, and they're in order from on my left here. First is Jackie Cabasso, who has been involved in nuclear disarmament, peace, environmental, and social justice advocacy at the local, national, and international levels for 35 years. She has served as executive director of Western States Legal Foundation based in Oakland since 1984. A leading voice for nuclear abolition, she was a, quote, founding mother of the Abolition 2000 Global Network to Eliminate Nuclear Weapons in 1995. Since 2007, she has served as the North American coordinator for Mayors for Peace. She currently serves as the national co-convener for United for Peace and Justice. She is also a contributing author to a collection of papers entitled Rethinking General and Complete Disarmament in the 21st Century, published by the United Nations in October of 2016, just a year ago. She received the International Peace Bureau's 2008 Sean McBride Peace Award and the Agape Foundation's 2009 Enduring Visionary Prize, and I'll bet a bunch of other awards also. Next to Jackie is Leslie Kucharski, I hope I got that right, a graduate student in the master's program in nonproliferation and terrorism studies here at the Middlebury Institute for International Studies in Monterey. From January to July of this year, 2017, she worked as an intern for the Weapons of Mass Destruction branch of the United Nations Office for Disarmament Affairs in New York, where she provided substantive support for the Preparatory Committee for the 2020 Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty Review Conference, as well as the UN Conference to negotiate the treaty to prohibit nuclear weapons, leading towards their total elimination. Her main area of interest is U.S.-Russian cooperation in arms control and nonproliferation. I tell you, if you're interested in international affairs and you're here in Monterey, you become very familiar with how to pronounce the word non-proliferation. Our third speaker will be Ms. Masako Toki, who is a project manager and research associate at the Nonproliferation Education Program at the James Martin Center for Nonproliferation Studies here at MIIS. She coordinates several disarmament and nonproliferation education projects for youth, including the Critical Issues Forum for high school students and teachers from around the world. Her research interests include Japan's nuclear disarmament and nonproliferation policy, She graduated from this institute with an MA in International Policy Studies and an emphasis on nonproliferation studies. She is originally from Japan, and she is also a member of the Japan Association of Disarmament Studies and the U.S.-Japan Leadership Program of the U.S.-Japan Foundation. And finally, our fourth speaker, Sarah Bitter, is a senior at Pacific Grove High School and is in her third year participating in the Critical Issues Forum that Masaku leads. For the past 2 years, she has served as a youth communicator for a world without nuclear weapons and has researched nuclear weapons, nonproliferation, and disarmament issues in her preparation for the Critical Issues Forum conference, for which she traveled to Japan this past spring. The conference was held in Nagasaki. There she presented her school team's research project on the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. In her high school career, she has participated in Pacific Grove High School's mock trial team, which has won second place at the annual county competition for 3 years, serving in various roles, including as witness and attorney. She is motivated by her love of logic and the simple thought of making the world a better place. So you can see we have 4 outstanding and diverse speakers, and I will now pass the baton from one to the other. So our first speaker will be Jackie Cabasso, who will be providing information about the process of negotiating the treaty and the ratification process, as well as the role the ban treaty can play in stigmatizing and delegitimizing nuclear deterrence. Jackie.
Thank you very much. Not that one? No. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here again. And you've given me a big subject in a few minutes, so I'm going to try to be expeditious, but I may run a few minutes over. So we're having this discussion at an auspicious moment because, as the first speaker said, the Nobel Prize Committee awarded the Nobel Peace Prize to the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons for its work to draw attention to the catastrophic humanitarian consequences of any use of nuclear weapons, and for its groundbreaking efforts to achieve a treaty-based prohibition of such weapons. But equally important, the Nobel Committee said, we live in a world where the risk of nuclear weapons being used is greater than it has been for a long time. Some states are modernizing their nuclear arsenals, and there is a real danger that more countries will try to procure nuclear weapons, as exemplified by North Korea. Nuclear weapons pose a constant threat to humanity and all life on Earth. Through binding international agreements, the international community has previously adopted prohibitions against landmines, cluster munitions, and biological and chemical weapons. Nuclear weapons are even more destructive, but have not yet been made the object of a similar legal prohibition. In its own statement, ICANN said, "This prize is a tribute to the tireless efforts of many millions of campaigners and concerned citizens worldwide who, ever since the dawn of the atomic age, have loudly protested nuclear weapons, insisting that they can serve no legitimate purpose and must be forever banished from the face of the earth." It is a tribute also to the survivors of the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the hibakusha, and victims of nuclear test explosions around the world, whose searing testimonies and unstinting advocacy were instrumental in securing this landmark agreement. But again, ICANN noted, this is a time of great global tension when fiery rhetoric could all too easily lead us inexorably to unspeakable horror. The specter of nuclear conflict looms large once more. If ever there were a moment for nations to declare their unequivocal opposition to nuclear weapons, that moment is now. So I want to, rather than just take ICANN as some recent phenomena, I want to just kind of go through some of the developments over the years that have led to this moment, some of the things that those millions of people and many governments have contributed to. I'm only going to start in 1970. We could go back to 1945. So in 1970, the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty entered into force. In the briefest possible explanation, the NPT was a deal, a bargain that was struck between the original 3 nuclear-armed states, the U.S., the Soviet Union, and the United Kingdom, and the rest of the world, because the existing nuclear-armed states feared that more and more countries were going to get nuclear weapons. So they pledged to get rid of their nuclear weapons. In Article 6, each of the parties to the treaty undertakes to pursue negotiations in good faith on effective measures relating to cessation of the nuclear arms race at an early date and to nuclear disarmament, and on a treaty on general and complete disarmament under strict and effective international control. That's what they pledged. The states that didn't have nuclear weapons pledged not to acquire them. And unfortunately, the nuclear armed states also promised to give the non-nuclear armed states an inalienable right to and assistance with peaceful nuclear technology. Of course, that's the foundation of nuclear power. And interesting to note that Iran was the first non-nuclear country to join the NPT. Under the original terms of the treaty, 2 other countries were allowed to come in as nuclear-armed states. That was France and China. Then the door was closed behind them. Ultimately, almost every country in the world joined as a non-nuclear weapon state. India and Pakistan refused to join because they felt the treaty was discriminatory. North Korea, which was a member, withdrew in 2003, and Israel never joined the treaty. So what we have now is every country in the world is a member of the NPT. All but 5 of them have renounced nuclear weapons, are prohibited from having nuclear weapons. The other 5 have pledged to negotiate the elimination of nuclear weapons in good faith, and India, Pakistan, Israel, and North Korea stand outside the treaty. In 1995, the NPT was extended indefinitely with a new round of commitments by the nuclear-armed states for a series of measures to achieve nuclear disarmament. In 1996, after a major international civil society campaign called the World Court Project, the International Court of Justice ruled on the legality of nuclear weapons, and they found the use of nuclear weapons would be generally incompatible with existing international law, but they also found unanimously that there exists an obligation to pursue in good faith and bring to a conclusion negotiations leading to nuclear disarmament in all its aspects under strict and effective international control. So that's the highest, most authoritative court in the world, giving its legal interpretation of Article 6 of the NPT. In 1995 also, when the NPT was being extended, non-governmental organizations, NGOs from all over the world were at the United Nations advocating for disarmament, and a large group came together and formed the Abolition 2000 Global Network to Eliminate Nuclear Weapons. And in its founding statement, it says, "We call upon all states, particularly the nuclear weapon states, to take the following steps to achieve nuclear weapons abolition. We further urge the states parties to the NPT to demand binding commitments by the declared nuclear weapon states to implement these measures." And number 1, first measure, initiate immediately and conclude negotiations on a nuclear weapons abolition convention that requires the phased elimination of all nuclear weapons within a time-bound framework with provisions for effective verification and enforcement. Abolition 2000 eventually grew to include over 2,000 NGOs in over 190 countries. And the following year, or actually 1997, working with international lawyers, scientists, and activists, produced a model nuclear weapons convention. That is a model treaty to encourage the governments to do something like that. It was accepted by Kofi Annan, who at the time the UN Secretary General, as an official UN document, translated into all the UN languages, and circulated as a deliberative document. In 2007, the Model Nuclear Weapons Convention was updated and again accepted as a UN document. I should mention that actually, over the years, there have been numerous United Nations General Assembly resolutions calling for disarmament, including the very first resolution in 1946. Now, the international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons actually came out of Abolition 2000. It was founded in 2007 by IPPNW, International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War, to campaign for the Model Nuclear Weapons Convention. And in 2013, it changed its campaign focus to an Ottawa-type process approach, focusing on humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons, as opposed to try to change the discourse from the security discourse, which the dominant nuclear weapon states were using. Very important along these lines was that in 2011, after years of being suppressed by the United States, the International Committee of the Red Cross finally came out strongly for nuclear abolition. I do note that the U.S. Red Cross is still not on board. There were several United Nations open-ended working groups that were mandated by General Assembly resolutions to develop steps for nuclear disarmament. And out of all this process came 3 humanitarian consequences conferences held in Oslo in March 2013, in Nayarit, Mexico in February 2014, in Vienna in December of 2014. These were international conferences hosted by the 3 governments to look at the humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons. And out of the 2014 Vienna conference came the humanitarian pledge. And I'm just going to read 3 paragraphs or so that kind of sum up the findings of the 3 conferences. Mindful of the unacceptable harm that victims of nuclear weapons explosions and nuclear testing have experienced, and recognizing that the rights and needs of victims have not yet been adequately addressed, emphasizing that the scope of consequences of a nuclear weapons explosion and risks associated raise profound moral and ethical questions that go beyond debates about the legality of nuclear weapons. Mindful that no national or international response capacity exists that would adequately respond to the human suffering and humanitarian harm that would result from a nuclear weapon explosion in a populated area, and that such capacity likely will never exist, we call on all states parties to the NPT to renew their commitment to the urgent and full implementation of existing obligations under Article 6, and to this end to identify and pursue effective measures to fill the legal gap for the prohibition and elimination of nuclear weapons, and we pledge to cooperate with all stakeholders to achieve this goal. We pledge to cooperate with all relevant stakeholders, states, international organizations, the International Red Cross and the Red Crescent movements, parliamentarians and civil society in efforts to stigmatize, prohibit, and eliminate nuclear weapons in light of their unacceptable humanitarian consequences and associated risks. 127 countries have signed that pledge, and the United Nations General Assembly adopted a resolution in December of 2016 mandating negotiations in 2017 on a treaty for the prohibition of nuclear weapons. There were 2 sessions of those negotiations. Civil society NGOs were invited to participate at a level that we've not experienced before in disarmament, or there aren't any disarmament fora, really, in the nuclear weapons fora in the United Nations. And I think the civil society actually did influence the outcome of the treaty. On July 7th, the treaty was adopted by a vote of 122 to 1, the 1 being the Netherlands, and 1 abstention, Singapore. It's important to note that all of the nuclear weapon states boycotted the negotiations, and all but 1 U.S. nuclear ally boycotted. So that included Japan, Australia, South Korea, and all but 1 of the 28 NATO members. All of these countries have arrangements with the United States that the United States will defend them with nuclear weapons. So they're all under the U.S. nuclear umbrella. So what does the treaty include? The Nuclear Weapons Ban Treaty prohibits the development, testing, possession, and use and threatened use of nuclear weapons, and also bars assistance in any way with prohibited acts. It also requires states parties in a position to do so to assist affected states with assistance to victims of nuclear testing and use, and with environmental remediation of contaminated areas. And it provides 2 pathways for nuclear-armed states to verifiably and irreversibly dismantle their nuclear arsenals prior to joining the treaty or after doing so. The treaty also generally provides that measures for verified and irreversible elimination of nuclear weapons may be addressed at meetings of state parties. Non-states parties may attend meetings, so other approaches could be created for nuclear-armed states to disarm. Treaty also reaffirms the existing illegality of the threat or use of nuclear weapons under international law, including the United Nations Charter and international humanitarian law. It opened for signature on September 20th. It requires 50 states to sign and ratify the treaty for it to enter into force. So far, 53 states have signed. I think 3 have ratified. So it's expected that it will enter into force within the next year or two. But something that's very, very important to realize and for us to get our heads around is that it only applies to the states who sign and ratify the treaty. And all of those states probably are already members of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty who have forsworn nuclear weapons. And many of them are also parties to nuclear weapon-free zones. So they've already banned themselves twice, and this is the third time they're banning themselves. So I'm throwing that in a slightly provocative way because I want to just sort of go into what some of the challenges are. I'll just greatly reduce this. So on August 8th, President Trump shocked the world when he warned North Korea that it will be, quote, met with fire and fury and frankly power, the likes of which this world has never seen before, if it does not stop threatening the United States. Now, I was in Nagasaki, where it was August 9th, the 72nd anniversary of the U.S. atomic bombing of the city. And Trump's threat was the top news story. And it was an expression of nuclear deterrence in its crudest and most naked form. On December 22nd, 2016, President-elect Trump tweeted, "The United States must greatly strengthen and expand its nuclear capability until such time as the world comes to its senses regarding nukes." Now, on July 7th, I was at the United Nations to witness the adoption by the majority of the world's countries of the treaty to prohibit nuclear weapons, which prohibits, again, the possession, development, testing, use, and threat of use of nuclear weapons. The vote by 122 to 1, as I mentioned, unambiguously demonstrates that most of the world has indeed come to its senses regarding nuclear weapons. But, as noted by both the Nobel Prize Committee and ICANN, we stand at a nuclear crossroads with a sharply divided world. While the ban treaty represents the total repudiation of nuclear weapons and nuclear deterrence by most of the states that don't possess or rely on nuclear weapons, in a joint statement following the vote, the U.S., France, and the United Kingdom declared, quote, "We do not intend to sign, ratify, or ever become parties to the treaty." Derek Johnson, the executive director of Global Zero, has assessed today's nuclear threat as an unprecedented moment in human history. The world has never faced so many nuclear flashpoints simultaneously, from NATO-Russia tensions to the Korean Peninsula to South Asia and the South China Sea and Taiwan. All of the nuclear-armed states are tangled up in conflicts and crises that could catastrophically escalate at any moment. As former Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev warned, it all looks as if the world is preparing for war. More troops, tanks, and armored personnel carriers are being brought to Europe. NATO and Russian forces and weapons that used to be deployed at a distance are now placed closer to each other, as if to shoot point blank. While the ban treaty negotiations were taking place in the United Nations, 2 floors up in the same building, in an emergency meeting of the UN Security Council, the United States was threatening military action against North Korea in response to its July 4th missile test. So we must keep both realities, the promise of the ban treaty and growing dangers of nuclear war, fully in mind as we develop strategies to accomplish the urgent goal of a world without nuclear weapons.